Perfect.
Great.
Thanks, Zanna. So I guess straight into it. Can you give us a little bit of description about who you are and what you do?
Yeah, so I'm a comparative psychologist, primatologist, and developmental psychologist, I suppose. And I work in Durham University. I'm assistant professor here, and I study, primarily I'm interested in grey apes and how they compare to humans, and with comparisons of children.
Okay, and you seem to have kind of veered towards studying bonobos, I guess is what I sort of know you for, I suppose.
Yeah, sure. So I've spent most of my, I've spent since my PhD, which was looking at communication in bonobos, I've ended up, becoming very focused on understanding bonobos and in many different aspects. So mostly because they're a fascinating species, but they're also our closest living relatives, and so they can really help us understand, processes of our own evolution. Because of this close phylogenetic relationship. So I think they're an interesting species to study things like kind of more complex aspects of social cognition, aspects of communication. I study empathy and sort of the more kind of pro-social sides of human behaviour. Mm-hmm. So they're a really good kind of comparison model for that, because they show us a rather different picture than I think people assume, that people kind of think of our primate past as being all, aggression and territorial and very kind of male dominated and all of this stuff. I mean, bonobos present really rather a different picture to that. So they've just fascinated me, and the problem is, the more I sort of study them, the more I want to study them more. So they're also very little known about compared to the other apes. So I sort of feel that there's a lot of scope there to discover a lot about ourselves from this species.
Well, absolutely. I was in the pub on the weekend, and I just thought I'd do a kind of straw poll of people who knew about some people had never even sort of heard of bonobos. So I suppose you're on this kind of constant sort of kind of battle almost to kind of keep raising the profile, aren't you? Just keep it.
So it's interesting because I wouldn't call it a battle though, because I sort of feel that
challenge.
It's a challenge in the sense that the reason I say that is because although a lot of people don't know about them, when I do, I do quite a lot of public talks, and I have quite a lot of engagement with the general public as well. Yeah. People are really interested in them. So like when I tell people about them, they're like, wow, I had no idea. And people really, really actually really like learning about them. So I find that once you start spreading the message, people really want to know. And so I sort of feel that that's part of my work as a scientist, is to expand people's horizons, because actually people want to know this stuff, they just don't have access to it.
Absolutely. So can we do a bit of a kind of 101 on bonobos? Where do they live? Where are they found? And what's their social structure? And
So bonobos are found in the Democratic Republic of Congo. They're the only they're endemic to the DRC, so they're not found anywhere else, which is interesting because chimpanzees, who are very close relatives of bonobos, are found actually currently in 21 countries in Africa, though they are rapidly becoming sort of wiped out from some of those countries actually. And bonobos have a social structure that actually resembles that of chimpanzees. So they have what's called male philopatry and female migration. So that means that the males remain in the natal group. So they don't leave they stay there for their whole lives. Mm-hmm. And the females leave and they emigrate, and they have to make new friends. Basically, they have to move groups. Yeah. And normally you would expect in that situation that the sex that remains in their birth group should be more related to each other and therefore more close to each other. Yeah. And the ones that leave should be basically strangers to their new group and shouldn't have strong friendships. But what we actually find in bonobos, which is particularly, I think one of the most fascinating things is it's actually the opposite. So the females form really strong relationships with each other, but they're all immigrants mostly. No, and almost all of them are immigrants, but they make these really strong friendships with each other. So it shows that immigration can be very positive for social bonds. Yeah. And the males actually are very close with their mothers, but they're not very close with other males in the group. So you have a very interesting pattern of sort of a sisterhood, but not based on real genetics. It's based on social affiliation among the females. And then you have very close sort of females who make friends with females and males in the new group. And then as a result of that, they become very dominant. So we have a mixed system, so males are not completely submissive, but they're not aggressively dominant to females. Females have very strong social power in the group, so I would say it's more of a mixed system where sex is not the defining factor of your dominance, and it means that females can actually have great social power in their groups. Which is very interesting. And typically the alpha in the community is a female, right, not a male. One of the really important and like fascinating parts about bonobos and their behaviour is that they show us that aggression is not the only way, and they're actually a very sort of fairly peaceful ape. They show reduced aggression. They show higher levels of female dominance. They show more egalitarian social relationships between males and females. And they show high levels of social tolerance. And so those behaviours show us that we very much have the potential to increase our levels of tolerance and sort of affiliation and reduce our aggression as a species, and that's part of our evolutionary past. And so I think they're really an important reminder that aggression and conflict can be resolved, and they're not the only things that define us as a species. And also that bonobos have these remarkable ways of resolving their conflict. So they're very good at resolving fights, and they use things like touch and grooming and sex. They also use, and it reminds us that the importance of resolving conflict and promoting peaceful relationships. And then also they are very friendly towards outgroups. So unlike most species, they don't show very strong territorial behaviour. They're actually very friendly towards strangers in different communities. Well, I wouldn't say friendly, but they're not physically very aggressive. Yeah. And what we find is that they can have fairly peaceful interactions with their neighbours. And sometimes they share food. Sometimes they even hunt together. Mm-hmm. And so it provides a really quite different picture about the basis of in-group and out-group kind of conflict in apes.
Yes, survival of the wisest as opposed to survival of the fittest in a way.
Yeah, I mean, they do have aggression and they do have competition, without a doubt, and they can get really, there can be fights and there can be problems, but they also have this way of dealing with them through kind of quite peaceful kind of conflict resolution strategies, and I mean, to this day we still don't have real records of lethal aggression occurring between groups, so it's very different to some other primate species that we might know. Yeah. So
And what is, I mean, physically, what's the difference between a chimpanzee and a bonobo? I mean, how would you?
Well, there's quite a lot of morphological differences actually, although they look very similar. Mm-hmm. So if you're not trained to know what they look like, you would probably confuse them. But generally, bonobos are a little bit smaller than chimps. Mm-hmm. They're slimmer. They've been kind of called sort of pedomorphic, so they have slightly more infantile like morphology, and that includes a really squeaky high-pitched voice. So bonobos have a very high-pitched voice compared to chimps, which is one of the main ways you can distinguish them. I mean, they sound like they're like 2 octaves higher than chimps. They're really very high. And then in terms of their sort of how you can distinguish them, they also have retained some juvenile features actually. Like they have rather pink lips. They have when chimpanzees and bonobos are small, they have a little white tuft on their bottom.
Mm-hmm.
Chimps lose that when they get older, but bonobos have retained theirs.
Yeah.
So it's another sign of that slightly more kind of pedomorphic traits. So they're a bit smaller and squeakier.
And is there sort of life expectancy the same as chimps, around about sort of 30, 40 years?
Yeah. It's very similar. So I mean, in many ways, the two species show very large overlaps in their life histories and so on. And yeah, they live. Well, it's hard to say in the wild, but they can live into their 60s in zoos. Females tend to live quite a bit longer than males.
Mm-hmm.
Most males in captivity don't seem to get much beyond 35, whereas females can get into their 50s and 60s.
What about the males not in captivity? I mean, what do they?
I think it's
is it more
similar.
balance out?
It's rather similar. Yeah, I mean, we have typically what happens if the females seem to live longer in bonobos, and that's probably to do with a lot of the social buffering that they have with their social bonds and their position in the group. And males, I think, seem to potentially encounter more issues with maybe stress and heart problems.
Yeah. And I suppose what's the main danger for bonobos